everybody, it's Nina. Thanks for joining me today. I have a fun watercoloring technique to share with you today that I'm calling watercolor palette smooshing. So if you're familiar with ink smooshing is where you take different inks that are water-based, apply them down onto a slick surface, spritz them with water, and then smoosh your paper into those inks. It creates a really fun, quick, and easy watercolor effect. I'm going to be using some watercolors today from Gansai Tambi. So you can see this is a really cool palette that has a lot of beautiful colors. We're going to be using this to do the watercolor smooshing technique. So we're going to apply the watercolor onto a palette, or you can use any type of slick surface. I'm going to paint it on and then be able to take my paper and smoosh it into that watercolors. That creates a really cool effect. You can see we created this galaxy background using that technique, and it creates a really fun, beautiful array of colors that blend together so beautifully. Now, when I created this card, I used the You're a Star die from Simon Says Stamp. This is a new die that's part of the Encouraging Words release, and this video is part of a blog hop. I'll have more details about the hop down in the video description and also on my blog. So when I used that die to create this card, I did a bit of inlay die cutting and created a beautiful dimensional sentiment. I had some leftover pieces, so I created a second card that features those leftover pieces. So this is a great example too of how you can use your leftover pieces from a first card and use that to create a second card, so nothing goes to waste. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and get into the watercoloring and show you the technique and teach you a little bit more about the smooshing technique if you're not familiar with it. And then we'll move on to creating the rest of the card. So let's get started. So I have the You're a Star die, and I'm actually going to start working with the watercolor, but I want to show you the die here close up. You can see it cuts out that great sentiment and then has a bunch of little stars around it as well. So for the watercolor smooshing technique, I basically just take some watercolor, twirl it onto my watercolor palette here. This is an Art Impressions palette, and then just lay my paper down into it. You can see it creates this really cool textural effect. Now if you want, you could add water onto this and have more of a lighter appearance, but I wanted more intense color and I wanted it to have texture. I didn't want it to blend completely, so I'm not using any water yet, but I will on some other layers. I do dry in between most of the layers. Some layers I didn't dry in between because I wanted the colors to blend a little bit more, and then most layers I did dry with the heat gun. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and do just a couple layers, but I wanted to create some really intense dark colors, so I'm going to go with lots of layers. As I'm layering, I'm just kind of playing around and smooshing colors into the palette. You never know what you're going to end up with, so it's really fun to see what happens once you lift that paper up off of the watercolor. Now you can also reuse the watercolor that's sitting on top of your palette once you've smushed the paper into that watercolor, and I did do that a couple times where I had some more paint onto the palette. I just spritzed it with a little bit of water and reactivated it, and that created a more lighter wash. So this is what I've got so far. I added a couple of washes by spritzing on some water so that way the watercolor had more of a liquidy appearance. And now here I'm bringing in some more layers, and I'm just kind of mixing colors and playing around and seeing what ends up happening. I want most of this panel to be completely covered with paint. So after I added all the colors, now I'm ready to go ahead and add some shimmer, because you need to have shimmer when you have a galaxy background. So I'm taking some of that beautiful shimmer color that's in the Gansai Tambi watercolors, and I did have a little bit of blue mixed in from just all of the paint that I had on my paintbrush. So it has a little bit of a bluish tint, but it looks beautiful. Once I lift this up off of my background, you can see it has these beautiful cloudy shimmery spots all over this panel. It looks so cool. Now I need to add some stars, so I'm going to bring in some of the white paint from that palette and a small paintbrush and flick on droplets of that white paint to create little tiny stars in the background. We'll also be adding some larger stars from that You Are a Star die. I'm also adding some bigger spots onto my background by just taking a paintbrush and dropping on some color onto the panel. Now I can die cut this using a Simon Says Stamp stitched rectangle die. And this panel is actually big enough that I'm able to cut 2 of them. So I'll be able to make 2 cards, which you have seen probably in my blog post or at the beginning of this video. So after I die cut the panels and cut them down into smaller rectangles, I'm taking the You Are a Star die and I'm going to cut this into the center of one of those panels. After I've die cut that into my panel, I'm going to use the negative piece and add adhesive all over the back of it, so that way I can stick this down onto a white piece of cardstock. The reason I'm doing this is because the white piece is going to serve as a backing sheet for behind this panel, so that way I can do some inlay die cutting. I also added liquid glue around all of the tiny areas in and around that sentiment, so that way I make sure those get all adhered down onto the paper nicely. Once I have that adhered down, I'm going to cut out that "You Are a Star" sentiment from a bunch of different pieces of cardstock. I used some purple cardstock and I cut that about 4 times to create a more dimensional sentiment. My sentiment isn't going to be in purple, it's just going to serve as a darker color to kind of blend into the background, and it's going to be the bottom piece for the layered sentiment that I'm going to be creating a little bit later on in this video. So I adhered all of those words down into those negative areas, fitting them back into place just like a puzzle. And when I die cut that background with the galaxy background with that "You Are a Star" die, I did also save all of those little tiny die cut pieces, including the little negatives that are going to fit in between all of these words here. I'm also going to use the little sentiment itself and the stars that were die cut from that "You Are a Star" die and that galaxy background, and I'm going to use those on the second card so that nothing goes to waste. Here I'm taking some shimmer cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. This is some beautiful yellow shimmery paper, and I cut this a few times from that yellow paper, and I'm layering 3 layers of stars onto my background here. I'm fitting those into place into the negative areas, and that's going to create some really cool golden looking stars in my background. Now that I have my stars and everything laid into my background here, I'm able to start working on finishing up my sentiment. For the sentiment, I want it to be this beautiful Nuvo black glitter embossing powder. This is such a beautiful embossing powder, and I love how shimmery it is. I'm going to do some inking onto some black cardstock. I'm smooshing my embossing ink onto that cardstock so that I have a nice sticky surface for the powder to stick on. This is going to create basically a black glitter cardstock. So I'm going to be able to die cut this paper after I've added the embossing powder and heat set it. I'll be able to die cut it with that "You Are a Star" die and have my own black glitter paper. And I love how beautiful this looks after it's been heat set. You'll know that it's heat set when the surface of the powder has a more of a shinier appearance. You can see here where it looks pretty matte, but now as I'm adding the heat, you can see down towards that right end of the paper, it's starting to get a shiny, almost silvery look. So that lets you know it's been heat set and you need to move your heat gun onto the next area of the panel. So I die cut that black glitter paper from the "You Are a Star" die, and I'm layering on some glue so that I can adhere all of these letters back on top of those purple pieces that we already laid down into our panel. Again, those purple pieces will just serving as a color that matched really nicely with the background so that the sentiment blends in really nicely, but still is dimensional. So now I'm going to finish up my card by taking a white piece of shimmer cardstock, and I'm going to cut that into an A2 card base. I'm going to take our little galaxy piece and finish off the edges by using some blue violet ink and adding that along the edges of the panel. This hides that white core of the paper and finishes off that whole entire piece nicely. I'm matting that onto some black cardstock to help draw in the black from the sentiment, and I'm going to trim this down using my paper trimmer so it has a nice border around the edges. Once I cut that down, now I'm going to go ahead and add some foam tape to the back side of this panel. That's so I can add this on top of my card with a little bit of dimension. To attach this, I'm using a bit of Scor-Tape in a 1/4 inch size. Finally, I'm taking some Nuvo drops and I'm using the white gloss color and adding just some little dimensional dots in random areas around my background just to help make things look a little bit more dimensional and add a little interest. And then finally, I'm taking some glossy accents and covering over my sentiment just to give it a shinier appearance and also adds to that dimension. So that's going to finish up this card. I love how that galaxy background just looks so cool with the "You Are a Star" sentiment. And then here's a look at the card that I made using the leftover scraps that I had from that first card. I used the sentiment and went ahead and layered that with some white cardstock to make a dimensional sentiment. And then I added a bunch of stars using that black glitter paper I made, and then also using the stars from the first card. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and got some inspiration on using some of the new products from Simon's Encouraging Words release. There is a blog hop associated with this video and also giveaways. You can find the link to my blog down in the video description so you can find out more about the giveaway and enter, as well as participate in the blog hop. There was also a blog hop on Friday, so you'll make sure to head on over to the Simon Says Stamp blog to get more information on that as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more inspiration. I will see you again very soon. Bye!